If it is your first time, you're jumping into week 2 of a message series that we started last week, titled this, Plant the Gospel. And kind of the subtitle of this series is a vision that bursts the bubble of church, what we're calling churchianity. As we dive in this morning, if you brought a Bible, that's great. If you didn't, no problem either. Everything you need will be up on the screen for you as we follow along in the scriptures together. But last week we started this series because I just truly believe this. We often talk about what it means to be whole Jesus people in our church family. And I just believe that one of the aspects of being a whole Jesus person has to do with how do we mobilize our faith? How do we put our faith into action? So last week we really just kind of started and began this series with the encouragement that you can do it. This is actually doable. Like this is a thing that isn't just some crazy idea, but I truly believe that putting our faith into action is something that can actually practically be done. So we looked at some pretty existential questions that I believe every human being asks, whether they actually tangibly say it or not, which is just simple questions like this: Who am I created to be? Who am I made? What am I made to do? Where do I fit in? And so last week we kind of began this series by talking about God's vision for abundance, and that we have a spiritual birthright to join God and with the purposes that He has planned on this earth. With your life, you actually have, I believe this, you have a specific corner of culture that only you, the unique you, can serve. No one can serve that corner of culture, that body of work that God has planned for you like you can. And so that truth, I believe, actually absolutely bursts the bubble of what we would call churchianity, which is usually this idea of the subculture of church, static church oftentimes. When we think about church, our imagination is oftentimes a building or a steeple, right? But we can't technically go to church because we are the church, right? The church isn't a static place. It's actually a mobilized people. And in turn, I don't believe that everybody's called to be a church planter per se, but I do believe this: it is our spiritual birthright for every person to be what we would call a gospel planter. What does it look like for us to mobilize our faith in a way where we plant the good news? What does it look like to be someone who brings the gospel, or that word gospel meaning good news of the kingdom, the good news of the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven? So we're going to look at our series Big Idea as we continue this morning. And it's this, be up on the screen. The series Big Idea, we always have one, is Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus describes God's vision for the world in such a way that provokes every Jesus follower to be mobilized into active service so that the goodness of God's kingdom can be more and more realized on earth as it is in heaven. I already mentioned this, but during Jesus' ministry on earth, he declared the gospel, the good news. And it's not just the gospel, it's the gospel of the kingdom, His rule and reign, and how that begins to impact us personally, but also how that begins to impact everything around us, our culture. And so we're going to begin today we're going to get to the letter of Ephesians, which is a part of our kind of the framework for this series, but we're going to create kind of a roadmap to get there. Because I think the big picture here is throughout human history, God has proven to be all about this agenda of saturating His creation with His goodness. The language that we see throughout the biblical narrative to describe this kind of saturation is this repeated language: fill, the word fill, filling, full, fullness. So we're going to look at just some rapid fire scriptures that kind of illustrate this. Let's start with Genesis chapter 1, the first chapter of the Bible. It says this in verse 28: God blessed them and said, speaking to humans, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill," there's that word fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish and the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. The prophet Habakkuk, in chapter 2 specifically, verse 14, I love the prophet Habakkuk because he's kind of in a wrestling match with God in terms of God's justice. He's questioning God, much like the prophets. Man, he's just being really open with God, and there's this response to his attitude and his perspective that God gives a response in chapter 2 in Habakkuk. And it says, God speaking, He says, "For the earth will be what? Filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Luke chapter 21, we get 10:21, we get into the life of Jesus as Jesus is walking on the earth. And he, for the first time, he's been spending time with these 12 ordinary men. And this is the first time that this group has enlarged, and now he's beginning to send them off. And it's crazy because the things that Jesus said they had spiritual power to do, they begin to see it. They begin to see powerful healings begin to take place through the empowerment of Jesus, through the empowerment of God. And after this is all said and done, the disciples, they come back, his followers come back, and they're like, hey, Jesus, like, this stuff worked. Like, literally, like, we have power. We have spiritual power. And I love the response of Jesus. It says, at that time, Jesus, full of joy through the Holy Spirit, said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. I love the picture of fullness of joy in the Holy Spirit in terms of, man, the power of God working through people. Acts chapter 2, the story of the early church, the day of Pentecost, which marks this big moment in church history. And it says, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven, and what? There's this filling, filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And all of them were what? They were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. A few chapters later, the early church's accusers, the people that were like, what is this thing that's going on that's beginning to threaten Caesar and Rome during this time? Rome is this massive regime of power. And by chapter 5 of the book of Acts, the enemies of God during this time, they make an accusation. These disciples, these early followers of Jesus, they've been flogged, they've been hurt, and they kind of stand on trial. And this is the accusation that's made in Acts chapter 5, verse 28. They say, you have filled Jerusalem. You filled it up. There's this language of filling that the enemies of God are accusing the church of. You filled up Jerusalem. And then we get kind of closer to the end of the early story of the church in Acts chapter 13. And this is after the disciples literally have been beaten once again and flogged. And it says, and the disciples were what? They were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. Much like Jesus was after he saw his disciples be sent out. Which leads into the context of Ephesians, which we're going to be looking at a couple verses in chapter 1 this morning. In the context of the letter of Ephesians, we looked at the book of Acts, which is the story of the early church. The context of it is Acts 28. Like, we're looking at the end of the story of the early church, where literally the Apostle Paul, who once was like a terrorist against Christians, gets rocked by God and becomes one of the leaders of the early church. And by this point, man, he's been wrecking shop everywhere, telling people about Jesus, telling people about the good news of the kingdom of God, and how that begins to impact everywhere that this message begins to manifest, not only in word but deed. So by this point, he's being detained. He's under house arrest by Roman authorities. They've had enough, right? He's been on trial. He continues to get tossed around. And for Paul, as the author of this, he's aware of this imminent persecution. Like, I'm standing on trial. Things just seem to be progressively getting worse as I live as a follower of Jesus. And so now he's beginning to paint a picture for the church of here's what it looks like I'm in chains, but if we're not and we're spread out, what does it look like for us as the church to continue to be faithful, not to be resentful, to actually engage in the things that Jesus said we could that are contrary to normal human behavior. This letter, the letter of Ephesians we're going to look at, is actually for the Apostle Paul. He's written a third of what we call the New Testament, the Christian Bible. This letter that we're going to look at right here, this is oftentimes considered the crown of Paul's ministry. This letter. And we mentioned this last week. The earliest manuscripts, it talks about, this is to the church of Ephesus, the region of Asia Minor. In the earliest manuscripts, it actually takes away the Ephesus part. This was considered a circuit letter, one for the entire church during that region to be circulated and say, hey, here's the big picture of we as the church moving forward. Things aren't looking great right in front of us, but here's what we need to continue to be faithful to. So he paints this beautiful picture in Ephesians chapter 1. And so we're going to be looking at verses 22 through 23. And this is what he says in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 22 through 23. And God placed all things under his feet, speaking of Jesus, and appointed him to be head over everything for the church, which is his body. Here's that language again. The fullness of him who fills everything in every way. See, throughout human history, God has proven to be all about the agenda, once again, of saturating his creation with his goodness. And so it's no surprise here at this moment in human history for the church that that agenda is on the front line for a vision of what it means to be the mobilized people of God. It's showing up here, again, this theme in conjunction with the church in this season of human history. I love what Jeff Vanderstelt says. It'll be up on the screen, a quote. A pastor who's from Tacoma. Shout out. I'm a Tacoma guy, Tacoma, Washington. He says this. He says, Jesus' saturation, every man, woman, and child in every place having a daily encounter with Jesus through words spoken and deeds done through his people. This isn't really any vision. It's God's vision. I love that. We're looking at the vision of God in this series and how oftentimes it bursts the bubble of our man-made constructs. And it's interesting, because even with this picture and this vision, I don't know about you, but sometimes it feels like we can maybe out-originate God, right? Maybe we can out-vision God in our own human cunningness, right? And so this morning's title, we're going to keep it pretty simple as we wrestle with these couple verses in Ephesians 1. The title of the message this morning is this: Jesus is really capable, and he's already at work. Jesus is really capable, and he's already at work. Now, I brought a little prop that's in my pocket this morning. I've used this similar illustration before. But this is a little Playmobil character. Anybody Playmobil in the house? Anybody? No? Yep, see? You're all Lego people. I knew it. Playmobil is kind of like the competitor of Lego. Just so happens my 8-year-old Luca, like the past few years, like it's been all about Playmobil. Now, I tried to grab the most bearded, like masculine-looking Playmobil figure ever. So this is actually Buford Mad Dog Tannen from Back to the Future 3. Anybody? Anybody? Come on. Maybe that's why Playmobil is the supreme thing, because it actually has Back to the Future theme. But this is let's picture this for example purposes this morning as what I think can sometimes represent Jesus. And once again, the illustration for us is to really challenge how big do we believe God is in our life. Because the size of what we believe God to be dictates how we engage with that very God. And so for some of us, if we're just being honest, this can become the size of Jesus in our life. Because how many of you guys know that, like, this is a prop that, like, you didn't know I had until I pulled it out of my pocket? It's convenient. It's small. I can control this type of Jesus. I can put him in when I don't want him. I can take him out when it feels right. The other thing that we need to acknowledge is, like, I think when we have a vision for God that sometimes, if we're being honest, can be this small, when it comes to the weights and the things and the pressures of this life, when God is this small, when Jesus is literally this small in our life, the weight of life begins to not shift on the size of this type of Jesus, but it begins to feel weighted down on our shoulders. We begin to take on things that maybe God never intended for us to take on. This size of Jesus, I can easily disobey him because he's so small. I can actually obey him for the wrong reasons because he's so small. See, with the size of Jesus this big, I'm in control as a human being in a relationship to Jesus. With Playmobil Jesus, we can feel like we're bigger. Therefore, we can feel sometimes like we have to perform flawlessly. He's so small. We feel like the world's placed upon our shoulders. And I believe we lose the God vision for our life because we've created a caricature of Jesus in relationship to our life. Our vision gets reduced down to a human level because he's so small, right? But this is what churchianity, I think, sometimes can be about, which will be up on the screen, a churchianity bias. A churchianity bias, I believe this, in terms of church culture, can often be, we need more effort, and success is on our shoulders. We can be like, well, if we don't do something, like this thing might all fall apart. This is a church construct bias that we can buy into. It's a lie that says, well, because Jesus actually in my life, you're this big, the pressure's on us. We got to do something. We got to perform. We got to be the church. But what's your vision for peace? Because I believe that Jesus' vision actually is fuller. What's your vision for love? I think Jesus' vision is actually fuller. What's your vision for justice? I believe Jesus' vision for justice is actually fuller. Goodness, Jesus' vision is fuller. Power, Jesus' vision is fuller. What is your vision for humans and the church? I believe Jesus paints a beautiful picture that blows churchianity out of the water. It's a greater vision. It's fuller. It's fullness that he promises. And I just believe in order to have more vision, we have to start with God's vision. In order to start with God's vision, we have to start with who is God? How big is God? Because how big we view God is going to dictate how big we actually believe his vision is. We've got to start with him. I love what Roger Helland, he says this. He says, a scholar and he's an author, he says, the starting place for gospel saturation is theological, not structural or methodological. An institutional temple spirituality primarily oriented around church buildings, Sunday services, programs, formalized professional clergy, or standardized denominational frameworks is not likely to produce a viral spiritual force of Christ followers in churches. I love this. This is the kicker here. Only a rigorous recovery of Christology, the doctrine of Christ, will revitalize Christians. What do we think about Jesus and his vision for the church, for us, and for the world? How big or small is our doctrine of Jesus? Let's go back to Ephesians 1, those verses, because this is the truth that Paul is proclaiming over the church, engaging in the world. He says, and God placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be head over everything for the church, which is his body, the fullness of what? Him who fills everything in every way. So number one, as we kind of begin wrestling with this idea today, is capable. All things are actually under his feet. In fact, Jesus, he lives life on earth, and he resurrects, and he ascends to heaven. And the scripture lets us in on that he sits at the right hand of God. He's ruling and reigning as king. He's got all authority. And the timeline of where we sit in human history and how we engage with God, we're engaging in a season where Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, ruling and reigning in all cosmic authority. And he's reigning through a kingdom that's in his opposition to the kingdoms of evil. I love John chapter 14, verse 12, because Jesus clues us in on us to not have anxiety around this idea that he's leaving. But this is what he says in John 14, 12 to his followers that are a little sketched out by the fact that he might depart. And he says this, he says, very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these because I'm going to the Father. So from a strategic standpoint, he's like, everything's going to be okay. Everything's all together. Trust that I'm capable because you're going to begin to see my power multiplied through you. The problem for us is that if we view Jesus so unintentionally small and incapable, the unfortunate and unintentional byproduct is planting more of ourselves in the world than of Jesus. I truly believe it's like, make disciples. Like that's what we're commissioned to do as the church. We can so easily make disciples of ourselves. We make disciples of all sorts of things. But are we making disciples? Are we leaning into the reality of a God who actually we believe is big enough to fill up all of the problems with his goodness and grace that exist in our cultural viewpoint of where we sit, where we understand, man, things aren't the way they're supposed to be. There needs to be change. There needs to be reform. I think about the opposition of just like we feel and we sense sometimes of like, man, like what's that yearning for more, that yearning for solutions. And I get overwhelmed. Anybody else get overwhelmed with problems in the world? Sometimes the problems we can identify in our country, sometimes the problem we can identify in our state, our county, our city, whatever it is. Problems. It's easy to point those things out. But I think it's oftentimes we can so easily default to our own human vision. We default to a vision that's just really, really small about what's capable to happen in a world because we're not viewing it through a lens and a vision that says, no, what does it look like, literally, for the reality of heaven to intersect with the reality of earth today? What does that overlap practically look like? All things are under his feet. And if that's true, how big are you if all things are under your feet? For this, it's like, not much. You know what I mean? Like, how much vision do we have for change in the world? Well, it might be the size of a speck, because if it's under that view and how we believe Jesus, then we're going to live out believing, man, like hell in a handbasket, let's go into the bomb shelter, let's wait for Jesus to come and take us back. And unfortunately, that's a sentiment that sometimes we hear within churchianity. But Jesus' vision is so much better, because he's inviting us and saying, wait a second. There's a reality that we can partake in, the gospel of the kingdom, his rule and reign beginning to intersect with the realities of earth today. He's big enough to fill everything in every way. He's big enough to fill the entire cosmos of the universe. He's the creator and sustainer who holds everything together. He's big enough to fill everything in every way. He's big enough to be the solution to every problem. Big enough to redeem any mistake that we make. Big enough to restore everything that's broken. God's vision is massive because Jesus is massive. So let's continue going on with this vision. Let's look back at Ephesians chapter 1 one more time here. It says, and God placed all things under his feet. And I love this part. Appointed him to be head over everything for the church, which is his body. The fullness of him who fills everything in every way. Jesus is capable. And because Jesus is capable, that means that we probably need to relax a little bit, because he's already at work. He is already at work. He's head over everything, including the church. And he's already at work, filling everything in every way. This is a part of his nature. We've seen this is what he does. And a commissioning for the church, as we see in Ephesians chapter 1, he's doing that. And an extension of that is this mutuality, this mutual participation that we get to participate in this very filling of the goodness of God manifest. I think about Jesus in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, when he's talking to Peter, who goes on to be one of the leaders of the church. And he says, who am I, Peter? Who am I? He asks him. And finally, it gets down to it, and Peter declares, well, you're Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for in Jewish history. You're the one that's to come and to restore all things. Now, their lens was very much through a human lens, and Jesus unknowingly begins to apply this in a more cosmic lens of what he's doing in the world. That's something bigger. But I love Jesus' response to him. He says, upon this rock, upon this confession, it's kind of a word play because Petra, means rock, literally in the Greek. He's like, upon you, upon this confession, upon that declaration, he says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He says, I'm going to build my church. I'm going to build my church. And upon you declaring it, guess what? You get in on the things that we get to see God do in the world, filling things up. The church is the fullness of who? Him. Plant the gospel. It's the title of this message series. And we can take that in so many different ways. And I'll just say this. Your agenda is not to be a pushy preacher salesman. Can I just say that? Your agenda, for those of you who remember this kind of evangelist figure, if you've been in church for a while, your agenda is not to be the next Billy Graham. Don't try to be somebody else. People, let's just begin this way. People aren't projects. Can we just declare that right now? Other human beings are human beings created in the image of God that should never be reduced down to a church project. But our agenda is to join Jesus where he's already at work. The ways that he's moving already. The way that he's filling everything in every way already. Because he's got a massive vision. we have different cohorts that sometimes we offer to us as a church family. We've engaged in one called missionary mindset. It just helps us create kind of training wheels of like, how do we think about living on mission? One of the tools that's really just stuck with me visually, and I want to share this morning, is a tool that comes from one of those cohorts, and just how to think about like just engaging people with our faith. And it's really, really simple, like to the point I'm like, it's kind of silly, but it's this idea of how do we partner with where God is already at work in people? And up on the screen, we just kind of have it. It's simple. It's a stoplight. It's simple because sometimes we need this. And it simply is this. Okay, red means unreceptive. Yellow means, it's kind of hard to see, interested. Green means hungry. I would say this. If you're in the room this morning, you're probably in the yellow or green category. You're like, okay, like what is this thing that God's up to, like church community, so on and so forth. You're probably not in the red category. But I love this tool because it's just a barometer for us to go, hey, it's not on you. The agenda is not on you to make a personal project. The agenda is on you to figure out, man, in my life, as I live my life, as I'm planted where God has already placed me, man, what does it look like to have discernment to go, hey, what does it look like to share my faith? Some people are going to be like, hey, back off. You kind of put a little dangling carrot out there. Yeah, like I was thinking, back off. Here's the point. Don't run the red light. Don't run the red light. As Christians, when you believe more is on your shoulders and when Jesus is big, you are going to want to run the red light time and time and time again because you believe it's on you. Rather that Jesus is already at work, filling everything in every way. And us as partners with that is to discern and say, God, how are you already at work? And how can I join you in ways to expand and share my view of faith with other people? Rather than feeling as an agenda that people are projects that I need to force feed something down their throat. That viewpoint makes Jesus' vision for the world so small because we believe it's all on us. But Jesus is so much bigger, he's so much greater, and he's already at work. I love this idea of capacity versus character in the way that we sometimes talk about God. Because God's capacity is big, but his character always shows us something about him, even in regards to his capacity. I oftentimes use the example, I think I shared this pretty recently, is that God has the capacity to be outside of time. He's God, we know that. But when you look at human history, what do you see? His character shows us he submits to time and chooses to be in relationship with us. I'm not doubting the capacity of God. I'm not doubting his greatness and his goodness, but his character shows, even within his capacity, that he meets us relationally in the midst of the world on a time-by-time basis, right where we're at. The same goes for his authority. Jesus can do whatever he wants with his authority, but that's his capacity. But what does his character reveal? His character reveals that he chooses actually mutual participation. Even when he doesn't have to and he doesn't need to. Plant the gospel, filling. I truly believe this. This is an invitation from God, not an imperative to prevent God's extinction. If we don't do this, people aren't going to know. He can't be this small. That's a vision that says, oh, you're bearing things on your shoulders. God's extinction is not at play here based on your faithfulness. He is bigger than this. He actually is already faithful. He actually fulfilled what he needed to fulfill on the cross by taking on all of our mistakes, all of the things that sometimes bog us down. He has already done it. What does it look like in relationship with him to join him with where he's already at work? Because he's already filling everything in every way. And we get to participate in an invitation with him and alongside him. Who are we as the church? Not a building, but a body. Not a program, but a people. Not an activity, but an identity. The people of God, healed by the power of God, commissioned to bring the purposes of God into the world. It's a beautiful relationship. The church is called to be like Jesus, filling everything in every way. We're taking cues from him and what he's already doing and his vision and his capacity and his greatness. Filling everything in every way. I oftentimes think about an aquarium when you fill it up with water. Everything is saturated. Every surface that exists when you fill an aquarium up with water is being touched by the water. That is what God is doing in the world as he fills everything in every way. There's a plan and a purpose, and then he invites us. What does it look like for us to partake and join him with where he's already at work? Every nook and cranny. Jesus' vision, it bursts the bubble of what we could call churchianity and church culture. And the church is called to be more than churchianity. I love what Alan Hirsch says. This quote will be up on the screen. He says, this is about the church. What are God's original purposes in and through his people? Is the gospel capable of renewing the world and transforming the hearts of all human beings? Did God really mean for the church to be the focal point for the wholesale renewal of society? The church that Jesus intended was specifically designed with built-in self-generative capacities and was made for nothing less than world-transforming, lasting, and yes, revolutionary impact. And so for us on a practical basis, as we look into the future and continue to lean into the greatness of God's vision for the world, the gospel of the kingdom, and his commissioning for us, an invitation for us to say, what does it look like to plan the goodness of God where we live, work, learn, and play? We have to shift. We have to shift our spiritual maturity from a viewpoint that says, come and see, to go and be. We have to shift it. The way the paradigm of churchianity that we think of because of maybe our tradition or what we grew up in is very much a bias to say, come and see. Come and see. Accumulate, building, centralize. But we know this. Jesus discipled the followers that he engaged with over 3 years for a purpose. And that purpose we see in the first 100 to 300 years of the early church multiply. Where the goodness of God was filling everything. The church's biggest critics, you have filled Jerusalem. How did you do that? The goodness of God multiplying. Here's what I believe our culture is we're gonna attempt to continue to lean into as a church family. As we talked about last week, this idea that rather than we can do it, the paid professionals, the staff, all this, and then you just help us with the things that we're gonna plan for you, we flip that. It says, no, you can do it because God has placed you with a spiritual birthright exactly where you're supposed to be. And how do we help you? How do we help equip and empower and see Jesus' vision multiply not through a specific religious clergy type of individuals, but understand that this is an all skate. We all get to play on the field. We all get to participate in what it means to plant the goodness of God in every corner of culture and society. God, I believe, is capable enough to find and commission faithful people who will find their calling and collectively be the solution to every problem in Burbank, Los Angeles, and beyond. When we see addiction problems, where we see parenting problems, where we see domestic violence problems, job problems, socioeconomic problems, vision problems, for us as a church to go, here we are, Lord. Use us, because your vision is so much greater than the problems that we might see. Where is our vision? Big or small? Human or Jesus driven? Where is our bias? Is it come and do? Is it just volunteering? Is it just fundraising? Is it just Sundays? Or what does it look like to be go and be? Live on mission for Jesus. Is it I'm uniquely called and created to shepherd every corner of culture that is mine, and it's going to push back on the kingdom of evil? Where we declare, man, it's my spiritual birthright to be an everyday missionary in one small part of a larger family who's encouraging new sons and spiritual daughters. And we're multiplying. And I want to end this morning on a quote, and it's a really honest one from Lance Ford and Rob Wegner. I read this and I thought, I really relate to this in my limited human vision oftentimes for what God's capable of doing in the world. In their book, The Starfish and the Spirit, they write this. It'll be up on the screen. It says, let's be honest. There have been many times in our past when our vision for mobilization has gone something like this. Lord, I need you to fill the chairs in the auditorium. I need you to fill the volunteer slots in the nursery during the third service. Come on, somebody. That's real. That's a real prayer right there. And the offering bags too, Lord. The temptation for church leaders is to make the end zone of mobilization the institution of the church and its programs. If we say our church is healthy, but the murder rate in our city is still high, fatherless is increasing, addiction is increasing, and we're not making any gains in universal flourishing in every corner of culture, is the church in the city healthy? If we continue to mean a building and a service when we say church, we'll never fill everything and everywhere. We aren't even filling our buildings anymore. See, here's what I know. New habits are easy to understand. Jesus' vision actually is pretty simple. Saturate. Multiply. The hard part for us is to actually lean out of the old habits, the old imagination, the old vision and expression of sometimes of what we mean when we say the church. I want to hit us with our big idea as we conclude this morning. Once again, Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus describes God's vision for the world in such a way that provokes every Jesus follower to be mobilized into active service so that the goodness of God's kingdom can be more and more realized on earth as it is in heaven. I end to declare the title of this message this morning. Here's what I know. Jesus is capable and he is already at work. So let's join him in where he's already at work. Amen? We're going to reflect this morning, much like we always do during this point in our gathering this morning. And so if you're new this morning, we love to give space. We never want Sunday to be a space where it's just a data dump of information. But my belief is when we engage with God, when we engage in community, there's opportunity for transformation. So we just use this space to go, okay, God, we ask a couple questions. God, what are you doing right now in me? I believe that God's so personal that he's oftentimes doing something unique in you as an individual. And then for us just to reflect on that. And so oftentimes we use the saying of creating an I will statement, journaling down, man, okay, maybe how do I act on the thing that God is highlighting in my life and take that step forward in faith and transformation and growth alongside him. So I'm gonna pray, and then we're gonna just give some space for some reflection time. Those 2 questions on the screen, and then we will conclude this morning. So Lord Jesus, we're thankful that you're massive.